Hello, welcome to the Writers at Work series. Today we are joined by Olivia Lanchester, who is the CEO of the Australian Society of Authors, for a really practical talk about the business of writing. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on unceded Gadigal land, and I extend my respect to elders past and present, as well as to the people of the lands that you're joining us from. So let me introduce Olivia first. It's quite impressive, don't be intimidated. So Olivia is the CEO of the Australian Society of Authors. Previously, Olivia worked as an intellectual property lawyer in private practice and as a freelance editor. Olivia advises authors and illustrators on all aspects of the publishing process, advocates for the protection of authors' interests, and liaises with industry organisations for better industry protocols. She leads the ASA's advocacy to government, including on copyright reform and the Australian lending rights schemes, which I'm very interested to talk about, and advocates for the recognition of authors as key drivers of the creative economy. Olivia is also a director of the Australian Copyright Council and sits on the board of the International Authors Forum. So welcome, Olivia.
Thank you very much, Belinda. Lovely to be here.
I think actually the way that we hear, I think they can see us online fine.
Fine, yes.
And so maybe don't have the screen distracting you and you can see everybody in the room more clearly. So I thought maybe to open up what the work of the Australian Society of Authors is, you might tell us what a typical day or week holds for you.
Okay. Well, if you don't know about the Australian Society of Authors, we are the professional association for writers and illustrators, and our members are hugely varied. So they're drawn from all parts of publishing, all writers, illustrators, no matter what genre. And it includes as well journalists and bloggers and poets and historians. It's a broad church. A typical week for me might be we answer advice, so advice queries from our members wanting to know any question about the publishing process, or if they've got something, they're in a dispute with their publisher and their agent and they don't quite know how to navigate that. So I do a lot of the advice queries. We do advocacy to government and to industry. We're very busy at the moment because we have a new arts minister and he is announcing a national cultural policy in December. So we are very busy trying to get literature spotlighted in that policy. And so we do advocacy on behalf of authors and also run professional development programs, so sessions on the business of being an author, on writing craft, on learning about any aspect really of being an author. We run a mentorship program where you can be mentored by a more experienced author. So there's the services that we provide to authors, as well as the advocacy side. And we've got information and resources. So we're always updating guides and publications that we put out, contract templates that we put out to try and give writers information.
Fantastic. I noticed, I was just looking at the website, I noticed you have little sort of workshops and online sessions too.
Yes, yeah, we do. So under our events program, there's usually something every week. And there's some courses specifically for emerging authors and others for established authors. So that is an annual program designed to help you on your way.
Okay. And so I think you've answered this question pretty generally, but maybe we could get into some more detail. Why should an author join the Australian Society of Authors? There are a lot of authors out there who are not members. Why should they join?
Because if you're a writer, you have your own personal network, hopefully, but you're isolated and you're your own small business. And I think it's very difficult for most writers to work completely in isolation, to have a professional association where you can go for guidance, for information, for advice and for community, to connect with other writers, to be part of something bigger. And if you support the ASA by being a member, then it supports our advocacy efforts. So we are, the more members we have, the better resourced we are to go to government to try and push for government investment and support. So it's all of those reasons. It's so that you can get the answer, you can get the support, you can get the information, and you can be part of the national creative community.
Excellent. I'm convinced.
Sales pitch done.
So you have a legal background. Can you tell us a bit about how you came to be doing this particular job, and maybe why this job might require somebody with that kind of background?
Sure. Well, I started at the ASA actually just doing a project, which was Authors in Schools. And it was a fantastic project, but it had nothing to do with my legal background whatsoever. The ASA runs a contract assessment review service, so you can get advice on a publishing offer made to you. And I ran that service in partnership with Arts Law for a little while, and saw, being at the ASA, how much copyright policy work the ASA did, and have always had an interest in copyright. And so it was kind of the marriage of all my interests in a way. I'm not a writer, but I'm an avid reader and love books, and thought this was a way to kind of try and, I guess, give back to the writers who've given such joy to me in my life. So I have, when our previous CEO left and she said to me, I think you should really consider this job, it was like the natural progression. The reason that copyright knowledge is crucial at the ASA is because copyright is the way that authors monetize their work. And without legislation that supports authors, they go backwards. And there's been a lot of copyright reform over the last decade. It's been subject to a lot of scrutiny really since digitisation. The Copyright Act was written in a print analogue world, and we're now living in a digital world. So there's been a lot of proposed reform, and not all of that reform has been supportive of authors. A lot of it has been coming from a mindset of supportive of users, which is, equally valid. Copyright is about a balancing act, but that's where my background has been really helpful in that analysis of law reform, really.
Okay, and bear in mind that you are talking to people who may not have much legal knowledge, but what do we need to know? What do you wish every Australian author knew about copyright?
I think in a nutshell, you just have to understand the basics of copyright because it's how you're going to earn a living. So you need to understand licensing. Nearly every dollar that an author or illustrator makes comes from licensing their copyright. You also make money entering into contracts for other things like appearances at festivals and schools and libraries, etc. But your work that you produce, you are the copyright owner by virtue of being the author of the work. And then I think what's key to understand is that copyright's not a single right, it's a bundle of rights. And teasing out those rights are how you generate multiple income streams. So if you think about a typical author who might license a publisher to publish their work in this market, and then they might have another publisher in the US, if they're lucky enough to be published in the US or Europe or Asia, that you can divide up your copyright territorially, and you can divide up your copyright by format as well. So you might authorize a publisher to publish your book in print and ebook and audio format. And then you've got the rights to license to a producer for a film or television adaptation. You've got the rights to authorize a publisher to make a translation of the work. So all the exploiting of your work begins with copyright, and knowing how you can optimize those strands will help you navigate your publishing contracts. Knowing how to terminate the contracts and get the rights back if they're not being exploited is important. Understanding those basics will just help you understand how you make money as a creator.
Yeah. it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think at the moment where you might be, you receive a contract and, you know, this is the moment.
Oh, so excited.
It's the
Where can I
chance-
sign?
Yeah,
Where can I sign?
and it's dealing, so that kind of list of numbers and percentages, it feels abstract if you don't have the kind of mind that processes these things, i.e. myself. And also the other thing that's difficult about it is it's hypothetical.
Yes.
So, and you don't want to make a nuisance of yourself over something, you know, you feel like a prima donna saying, well, I'd like a bit more of the film rights, thank you. And it's like, you think, who am I? You know, are they going to film this? So what would you say about confidence and such things?
I would say that if you want to make a career as a writer, you have to have a small business owner mindset that you can put on in that situation, because you're right, Belinda, you get the publishing offer, it's so exciting, you just want to sign, you don't want to negotiate. If you don't have an agent, everyone hates negotiating. It's like negotiating for a pay increase. It's painful, no one likes it. But I think that if you don't have an agent, the first thing I would suggest is get independent advice. Don't sign a contract if you don't understand it. Don't sign a contract if you're new in your career and you've never had advice before, so that you understand the deal. But second of all, it's okay to negotiate with publishers. They expect that there will be a level of negotiation. They are a business partner of yours. I know that there is a feeling in publishing of gratitude. I'm so lucky to be published. I'm so grateful to be made an offer. Now, of course, I think you must be professional and you must be polite in negotiating with the publisher, but it's your work, so you've got to protect it. And if you negotiate reasonably, that will never come back to bite you. It's only the authors who are immovable or unreasonable who get off track. So I would say have the confidence, or have the confidence even to query if you don't understand things.
Okay, well, that leads me nicely into a question about agents. Should we, do we need them? Are there sort of contextual specifics about whether we need them? What's your view?
Look, as with so many questions in relation to publishing, the answer is it depends. I think if you are writing a title for a mass market and you want to access one of the big multinational publishers, you're better off having an agent. For example, you can't, HarperCollins doesn't accept unsolicited manuscripts. So if it was your dream to publish with HarperCollins, you need an agent. Similarly, Penguin Random House, those big publishers, you are better placed if you've got an agent. If you're wanting to submit to a smaller independent Australian publisher, you don't necessarily need an agent. And if you're comfortable and confident with negotiation, then you can do that on your own behalf. Whereas if you're desperate to outsource that, an agent is better. The thing to remember about an agent is they do take 15% commission. So your royalties, your advance, even sometimes your PLR and ELR and other copyright agency payments will all be subject to that commission. And earnings, as we know, are low. So an agent has to be worth it. A lot of them are. It's the access to publishers that you get with an agent. So that is the big key. And if you want one of those big publishers and you are writing the sort of work that's going to be a big commercial work, then you probably want an agent.
Okay. I mean, I would just add, I mean, this is, you know, it's one case. I didn't always have an agent. I had agents at various times, but I remember this moment where they negotiated audio rights. I got a better deal on audio rights, and then those were picked up. And I thought, oh, that just paid the agent's fee.
Yes, 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 yeah.
So apart from anything else,
getting opportunities.
Yeah. And I mean, I have found great value in agents. I think the other thing that agents give you is advice as well.
That's true.
They can be supportive of an entire career. And they sort of know what's happening in the publishing world. They've got the inside track. which not that you need to know the gossip or anything, but just some information is useful.
Well, and they probably know as well where to best place your work.
Yeah.
And they are a sounding board. And some agents will give you feedback on manuscripts, and, you know, different agents will set different boundaries, but they're in your corner, and they're there for career advice as well as publishing opportunities.
And so how would you suggest, if somebody decided that it was worthwhile to them to approach agents? Do you have any advice about that?
Yeah, it's difficult to get an agent because it's competitive, like every area of publishing. So the submission process is quite similar to submitting to a publisher. They'll have on their website how they accept submission, whether they want to see a sample of your work and author bio, or whatever it is that they want, or when they're open for submission. So you research agents. This is where it really pays to be embedded as possible in a writing community, so that you can talk to other writers about their agents and what they think, and then you can kind of build up as well an understanding of that agent's good for that sort of work, and this information is also on their website, what they're looking for and what the sort of authors that they represent. So you'd want to do, I mean, first of all, you just want to do some desktop research. You can go to the Australian Literary Agents Association website. There's a list of agents there, and you can just go through. I mean, now I think what a lot of writers do sounds very basic, but it's actually helpful when you're reading in the genre in which you write. Always read the acknowledgements at the back of the book, and who do they thank, and who's their agent, and who helped them on their way. I think that that's a little thing that is informative, actually.
Yes, I always have a look. Okay, so we had a little chat beforehand about the state of things for authors. And what was leading me to think about this was this morning, I heard on the radio as I was coming in that Tom Keneally had won the Historical Novel Prize. And he was very gracious, as always. And he's a great supporter of other writers, very kind man, I get the impression. And he shared his prize with the long list. His position was that, actually, he said, I wrote it down because it was sort of funny in a dark way. He said that writing is a matter of combining pittances. So I think he wanted to throw, you know, a slightly larger pittance in the way of these writers who put so much work in. He also said, because I always worry when people do this, that they're setting a precedent. He said, I'm not setting a precedent. I have a particular history. I am of a particular age. Other writers need to hang on to their money to create writing time, but he doesn't. And I was also thinking of Evelyn Araluen winning the Stella Prize. She said that she was a paycheck away from poverty, and that this is no way to fund the arts. So I wondered, you know, what you think the state of things is, and perhaps talk a bit more about the advocacy work you do, what it is that you're trying to make happen.
Yeah, sure. And that theme that you talk about with Evelyn and Tom Keneally is common. Richard Flanagan, when he won the Booker Prize, famously said, look, I was looking at getting a job in mining before the Booker Prize allowed him to continue to work as a writer. Melissa Lukashenko, when she won the Miles Franklin, I think it was, she said, I'm Uber driving for a living. So it's very common that we have these acclaimed, hugely luminary authors struggling to earn a living. And literary fiction is particularly poorly remunerated. Well, all of writing is. So so first of all, just in the way that an author earns a living, it is through, as you know, Belinda, a portfolio of income streams. It is earning from book sales, but also through appearances at schools and libraries and festivals, and also through lending rights, which we might talk about, and through copyright agency payments, which is when your work is copied in schools, that triggers a payment back to the author. A lot of authors have a day job. A lot of writers teach, well, for example, and it's that drawing together of multiple income streams. It's very, very few authors that only earn from their writing alone. In terms of our advocacy, look, literature is chronically underfunded, and the last decade has been terrible. There's been a 40% decline in funding for literature through the Australia Council, which is the federal funding body for the arts. And it's so low now that I think in the writing community, to be really frank, there is a bit of a feeling of despair. However, there is also, I think, a feeling of hope, because we have a change of government and we have a arts minister who is talking about those art forms that have fallen through the cracks. And my hope is that literature has been recognised as one of those art forms. So what we're pushing for is much greater government investment directly to the creators. Of course, the literary ecosystem needs to be funded, you know, the literary magazines and journals and literary festivals and service organisations such as us, although we do not receive we don't receive organisational funding. The ASA gets a little bit of project funding, but we don't have government funding sustaining us. But really where our focus is better grants and a fellowship, sort of a Commonwealth grants and fellowship program for authors. And we want to see an increase to the lending rights budget, because it's such a good way of getting dollars to authors. If you look globally around the world, there's this issue of we all know how important books are, we all know how important writers are, but earning a sustainable living is really challenging. And there's some interesting, in Ireland, for example, there's an interesting pilot of a living wage scheme. We've pushed that to the government. I'm not sure that that will have legs. It's just so expensive to run and politically hard to sell. But our advocacy is, you know, all the practical ways that we can see how can we just make a writing career more sustainable.
Yeah, it can be difficult culturally. Ireland, I think, also has a sort of history of tax breaks for writers.
Yes.
So it's not coming out of nowhere.
Yes.
It's something that's already kind of in motion. Yes, the basic living wage, amazing. So what I might do is just alert the people in the room and the people on Zoom to the opportunity to ask questions. So I think if you're on Zoom, please put them in the chat, and I will just keep an eye on that out of the corner of my eye, because I do want you to, if you have practical or just things that you've never known about the business of writing, now's your chance, and we will all share the benefit of the answer. But as you're thinking those up, I'll just ask you about lending rights, because this may be something that people don't know about, and it's fantastic.
It is a good scheme. This is something that I think Australia really has got right, and it is a world-class scheme. So once you publish a book, if your book is bought by libraries and held in public libraries or school libraries, educational libraries, universities, TAFE schools, then that book is there on the shelf and it's able to be borrowed by anyone in the community. And when you talk about public libraries, for free, which is fantastic. So there's good community access to books. The difficulty for an author and a publisher is that you lose royalties. If that one book is borrowed again and again and again and again and read for free, those readers aren't buying your book because they're borrowing from libraries. So Gough Whitlam, back in 1975, introduced the public lending right, which is a payment to authors when their books are held by libraries to compensate them for the loss of sales, book sales. Recognising we want to have public libraries, we want to have community access to books, but we need to recompense authors and publishers. That's lending rights. It's an annual payment. Authors, if they're eligible, you have to have a minimum of 50 books in libraries to be eligible. And once you're in, you get a royalty of $2.11, I think, is the current going rate per book held in libraries. We're really campaigning because this whole scheme, which is fantastic, only applies to print books. But library collections are going digital, and library patrons increasingly, particularly over COVID, as you can imagine, when all the libraries shut down, closed their doors, are borrowing in ebook format and audiobook format. So we are pushing the government to say this scheme is fantastic, but it has to be expanded to include digital formats as well as print formats. But once you have a book published, it's really worth registering for the scheme. You just fill in a form, you register, and then you wait for the money, Belinda.
You do. And I will say the money is nice. There are many years I don't make any royalties, but I always make some library money, and it's always enough to be quite thrilling, you know, to do something with. And the other thing that's really delightful about it is that it is the evidence of people still reading your books.
Yes.
Which is really lovely,
Yes.
because books these days, they have a moment, and the moment can be terrifyingly brief.
Yes.
After having worked on something for years. You know, the book still exists. Remember this, the book still exists. People can read it at any time. But that sort of practical acknowledgement that people are still reading your books, libraries are holding them, people are reading them, is very warm and fuzzy.
Yes. Yes.
It's great. So I don't think I've got any questions on the chat yet. Are there any questions in the room? Ryan?
Yeah, I've got two separate tracks of questions. Why do you think, besides the sort of like past nature of the change of government, why do you think there will be a difference in coming terms when it comes to what will happen in the industry going forward? And then on the other side as well, what are the mistakes of young writers?
Okay, I'm just going to repeat that because that won't have reached the mic. So Ryan's just asking what practical difference a new government might make, and what are the mistakes that young writers make. Thank you, Ryan. Early career, sorry, yes.
Well, on the government question first, I think the big difference is that this government has a cultural policy, and under the coalition government, there was no policy. So there just wasn't an arts policy from the Liberal Party or the National Party. So I think there is once you have a policy, then there is a framework to pitch for funding and for support. And that's not to say that the previous government did nothing for literature. The RISE funding is an example of, that was COVID emergency, response funding, but that was something that the previous government did. I just think that this government has a stated intention of, we're introducing a cultural policy, and that's an opportunity, I think, for us to try and persuade the government that actually literature needs investment and is worth investing in. And it's not just about government investment. The book industry is strong. So another thing that's come out of COVID is actually a stable and strong book market. In Australia, sales were up in 2020 and 2021, and that probably has something to do with the fact that we were all at home, and so we all read more and we all bought more books. So there's a role for government, but of course there's a role for industry. And on the commercial side, there's a lot to be excited about, because actually the book market is doing well. It's hard to get into it, but there is there's the influence of Amazon, which is a whole separate conversation, which I have some concerns about. They're not a major player in this market yet, but when they come here, if what happens in Australia echoes what has happened in the UK and the US, Amazon will be the dominant retailer, and then things will potentially be much harder. We have the advantage in Australia of a very strong independent bookshop network, and those indie booksellers champion Australian authors and really get Australian authors into the hands of readers. So that's the answer for why I'm hopeful that a new government will bring something, because there's a there's a policy announcement coming. As for what mistakes do young early writers make, I think it's really, really hard to write a manuscript. And if you get to the end of that exhausting, challenging process, then a lot of writers just want to publish tomorrow, of course. But I actually think taking time at that point to understand your options and get your submission really great and not go too early. We see a lot of early writers pitch manuscripts before they're quite ready for submission phase. And then, you know, it's a one bite at the cherry kind of game publishing. Publishers hate to see them say manuscript twice. So you want to make sure that you've just taken the time. If you've never had anyone read your manuscript other than your mum and your best friend, and your mum and your best friend love it, that's not enough. You have to have, in my view, as a brand new author, some sort of professional assessment or someone who has been in the industry say, this is at publishable standard. Doesn't need to be edited. It doesn't need a professional edit. You don't need to pay for that. Publishers get that. But just taking your time at, you know, not rushing in, not signing on the bottom line of your contract before you've got advice, just having the patience to be as savvy, as business savvy as you can.
We've got a question online, but I've just got a follow-up question to that about assessment. So do you have advice about finding quality there, finding something that really does the job?
Yeah, because an assessment is only worthwhile if it comes from someone with experience who is qualified to make an assessment, which is why you can't trust your best friend, even though your best friend might say, love it. You can go through IPED, which is the Institute of Professional Editors. They've got a search directory where you can search for an experienced editor who offers manuscript assessment. And the feedback we've had is that that's really good. It's just on their website, their search facility. So you can find someone experienced in your genre who's able to really give you an objective view. And you can come to us. We have got some mentorship programs, and you can have your work assessed through that. We've got a first 10 pages where someone just reads the first 10 pages of your work and will say to you, this needs work, or you're away, and give you feedback. And the writers' centres also offer manuscript assessments. So the state-based writers' centres in New South Wales, it's Writing New South Wales.
Great, thank you. Very practical advice. Okay, let's have a look here. Okay, Harold. So your question relates to the status quo of Australian publishing. Wow, you've really got your details covered. Thank you for the research, Harold. So your ASA 2021 survey says 58% of respondents indicated they received no advance for their work. 80% of respondents received advances of 5,000, and only 13% received an advance of greater than 10,000. So no author in Australia, there might be one or two, are being paid an advance that constitutes a livable income. So bearing in mind that advances are effectively loans to publishers because the author has to pay out their advance back to the publisher in royalties, and these royalties attract tax. Harold, this is exemplary knowledge. And these royalties over the years require the author to sell thousands of copies to be earned back. My question, thank you. How does this remuneration structure represent the thousands of hours, years spent on writing one book? Could the industry be restricted so that advances don't constitute loans nor attract tax? That's my preference. Publishing houses act in such a way that everyone is treated equally. Harold, amazing, thank you.
And look, so yes, our survey did show that advances are declining. I'm the voice of gloom today. Advances have declined over the years. And that notion, you know, we sort of have this notion that an advance gives you money to live on while you write the manuscript. And that would only be the case for a very small slice of authors. There are some big advances still paid. So the big publishers are still paying advances, even in the, even in excess of $100,000, but they're rare. And for many authors, you don't get an advance at all. And to answer Harold's question, you may not be remunerated for the hours and years that you put into a book, which is a little bit heartbreaking. And Belinda and I, before we began, we're just talking a little bit about how partly writing needs to be done for the love of writing, because you just do not know whether your book is going to sell well or a little bit or not at all. And there's definitely an element of luck and timing. If your book sells like Boy Swallows Universe by Trent Dalton, then you'll make a lot of money. And it's a little bit like the music industry, like that. You think of all the musicians out there, and then there's that tiny slice at the top that earn a lot of money, and the rest, that long tail. In publishing, there's a long, long tail. In defense of publishers, they're not making a lot of money either. The publishing business model is a little bit like the music business model, the 80-20 rule, where 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your products. The whole industry is kept afloat really from the best-selling books and also the steadily selling backlist titles, those books that just go on to sell and sell and sell for years. So but this is why you need to have the best contract you can and the best royalties you can and rising royalties, so that if you are one of those lucky authors, talented authors whose work sells well, that your royalty percentage ticks up after a certain threshold of sales, so that you can share in that, better share in that success. So you can try and negotiate for the best deal you can with your publisher. It would be great if author earnings were exempt from tax. And we were talking about Ireland before. Ireland has, as you were saying, Belinda, the tax exemption. I mean, in Australia, we've got a tax system where you're in tax brackets, and so you pay lower tax if you earn less, etc. I think that tax reform is a difficult one to tackle.
The bee in my bonnet is tax on prizes.
Yes,
it enrages me.
Yes, yes.
We don't know we're going to get that. Nobody knows they're going to get that. It's not earnings.
And it's a big chunk once you've paid tax. If it's a decent prize, you can lose a lot of it to tax. The Prime Minister Literary Awards are the only awards that are tax-free. So we have said to the government, all literary prizes should be exempt from tax. And we've also said that all government grants should be exempt from tax as well.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a chat about advances. So I'll just check, are there any more questions in the room? I'll just go to Ishita first. Ishita, what's your question?
I just had a question about copyright. So if the new writer is supposed to get the copyrights before going to a publisher, or is that something the publisher does after you submit your selected?
I'll just repeat the question. Sorry, Olivia. Ishita asks about, it's sort of about how copyright becomes attached to you. Is that something that you have to do something about before you submit work, or does it happen in the publishing process?
It's automatic. You don't need to do anything to be the copyright owner. Once you have written your manuscript, by operation of law, you're the copyright owner by virtue of being the author. You don't have to register copyright. You don't have to fill out a form. You don't have to do anything. I mean, it's good practice. You will have seen on a lot of manuscripts your name at the bottom with the copyright symbol, but really that's just a notice saying I own copyright. You own copyright by virtue of having written it.
Thanks, Ishita. And Ryan?
From the perspective you have with publishers, when they take it aside, what do they tell you that or now instead you'd like to be able to transmit?
Well, particularly if you're writing in non-fiction, but also fiction, publishers love it if you've got a platform, which is a new source of work really for authors. But if you have any kind of ready-made audience, that's definitely a factor in your favour. So if you've got a following on Instagram or YouTube or whatever is your platform of choice, that helps. If you're a good speaker, if you're someone who presents well, that's also favourable. But nothing replaces content. If you've got a winning manuscript, then that trumps everything. If you've got a really good manuscript and you also come with the confidence to present well at festivals and a ready-made audience and a bit of a following, then, you know, so much the better. In terms of publishing trends, because publishing is led by fads, I don't know whether, you know, if you try and write to a current fad, by the time you've written the manuscript and pitched the manuscript and then it's gone through editorial and then 2 years later it's finally published, you've lost the fad anyway. So in terms of trying to jump on a trend, I think that's really hard to do and turn around quickly enough. So you're better to write what you're passionate about and what you want to write, and hope that a publisher is wanting to, you know, pick you up. There was a time during COVID that publishers were saying nothing melancholy because we were all so sad, and escapist fiction did really well. But now I think things are getting back to normal. Publishers always say, we want something unique and fresh, but they're also such risk-averse creatures in many ways, because, you know, so many books don't do well that they do tend to go back to tried and true and publish what's worked before.
Maybe they want to be convinced, though. Maybe
Yes.
that's where the opening is.
Yes, yes.
Because they want the unicorn.
yes.
You know,
They do, yes.
they're just nervous about what it takes to get there. Understandably, I guess. So there's a little conversation going on in the chat about the way that advances work as a loan. And so I might just sort of clarify this with Olivia. Can you see that conversation?
Yeah, I can. So an advance is an advance on your royalties. So say you're paid a $5,000 advance, you get that usually in installments when you sign the contract, and then maybe when you deliver the manuscript. Sometimes you might get the last installment upon publication, and you've got the $5,000. And then your book goes and sells, and you need to earn out your advance before you're then paid royalties. So an advance is an advance payment of royalties. Once your royalties have accumulated to that $5,000 level, you've earned out your advance, and then you start receiving payments from your publisher.
Okay, great. Is anyone in the room waiting to ask? You okay? Because I have more questions. And we do have time online as well if anything else comes through. So I wanted to ask you about advocacy, and it seems to me that one of the ideas that the ASA represents is that what we can do as a collective is much more than we can do on our own, even though writing is considered a solitary pursuit. So is there anything that we as writers can do to improve the general state of the industry? How can we act collectively?
I think, yeah, it is that coming together. So it is, whether it's joining a writers' centre or joining the ASA, being part of something bigger, because that gives an amplified voice, and not just to Canberra, but also to publishers. So, you know, we've done some negotiating with the Publishers Association, for example, on their member code of conduct, and we've had a couple of little wins that have improved things for authors just through industry consultation. But we can't do that without the support of members. So I think joining your professional association, the ASA is the closest thing there is to a writers' union. I mean, there is the MEAA for journalists and for other creative professionals, but for book authors, the ASA is it. That's important as well for knowledge sharing. So for all of you, if you have careers as writers, you will see that the source of so much information for you are other writers, and learning from each other. I think writers are incredibly generous the way they support. It is actually a very warm industry, And so that's important, just to be part of something a bit bigger, because I think the reality, if you're working from home, as many writers are, it's easy to feel a bit lost, and everyone needs the support of being part of, you know, something bigger.
Yeah, I think there's sort of an extra layer of uncertainty. This is not true for all writers, but a lot of creative writers are kind of making something up. You know, they're doing something that might be considered in your low moments as sort of silly. You know, I'm doing this thing that children do, this kind of imaginary play and just playing with words. And that's harder on your own. Like the thing that I've got out of in the past, out of having other people read work, out of being fortunate enough to go through a program like this myself, is to sit in a room with people who take this seriously as well, and to have a community that encourages you, so that you don't sit there feeling silly and like it's pointless. Because if it's silly and pointless, then that's true for all these other people that you like so much, you know.
Absolutely. And I think for most creators, it's hard to not have moments of being beset with self-doubt. It's really hard to put something that you've worked on, something creative you worked on, out there in the world. I think there's a vulnerability in writing, and that vulnerability is hugely ameliorated by what you're saying, having connections with other creators, and you can build each other up. And there is that validation of each other's work. And we know that actually creating something, it's fundamental. It's fundamental to being human. It's not silly. When you're the person, I think, particularly because it's so hard to be successful, it can feel like, oh, this is so difficult. And if you also are struggling to earn a living, well, how do I get meaning? But I don't need to say to a room full of writers how fundamentally important books are. And it's not just for reading and pleasure and entertainment, but actually for literacy, for educational outcomes. There's research that suggests that reading lowers stress and helps with social cohesion, national identity, all of those things. You know, the benefits are profound.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, and that idea that what young people read as well always seems to me particularly important, to see themselves on the page. So I think the difficult thing about writing sometimes is you don't know who you're writing to, because it doesn't happen live in the moment. So that kind of feedback is delayed, but you have to believe that it happens. Okay, are there any more questions in the room? Yes, and last chance online as well. So one more from the room.
Where do you think the government wants to see industry change? It's in relation to their treasury spending. So it seems like they're signaling towards the direction where they're trying to reform policy that over the last decades, almost what they wasn't done. Do you think there's a really concise opinion they're rejecting what they want to create arts industries?
Okay, I'm just going to repeat that. Good question. So Ryan asks, is Olivia getting a sense of what the kind of shape that the government's future moves might make in terms of the arts?
Well, going on what they've said, I think what the government wants to see is First Nations first. So I think they want to see a celebration of our First Nations art and culture and creativity. I think that they want to support industry. I don't think the government is interested in propping up organisation after organisation. I think it's about skilling and fueling industry to be profitable and successful. I mean, I think what the government should want, and I assume what they do want, is to take our stories to the world. Australian authors are nationally beloved, but also have had some wonderful international success. And obviously with that comes all sorts of benefit for a government, soft diplomacy, reputation. Those things are really important. I was really surprised to read, there was some research done by Macquarie University recently, which showed that our biggest export market is China. And I don't know why that surprised me, but I guess because we've had such close ties with the English-speaking world, the sort of Anglosphere, and then with Europe, particularly with the International Book Fair Frankfurt being in Europe, it surprised me to learn that China was such an important export market, particularly for Australian children's books, but across all categories. So I think that, you know, I'm now putting words into the government's mouth, but I think that they would want to see the building up of the industry here so that it's self-sufficient, so that it's strong, so that there's export potential realised. That's what I think, you know, any government wants to, no government wants to be, I think, in the position of being a funder. I think they want to be in the position of being an investor. If we invest, then there will be this return. And books are great because you only need to invest a little bit to have a proliferation of jobs. And, you know, a lot of our most iconic stories on the stage and on the screen began as a book. You look at The Secret River, or Christos Tsiolkos's books have been adapted, and Helen Garner's books have been adapted. Tim Winton, oh my gosh, Cloud Street and Breathe. And so there's so many of our, and Boy Swallows Universe is now a stage play, and it's becoming a television series as well. So it's the engine room of the broader arts, and that's where I think government should focus their invest here to drive the creative economy.
Great. I'd very much like the idea of you putting words in the government. Olivia, you have my support.
If only I could do it more often, Belinda, to a wider audience.
Okay, so I will say thank you to Olivia, and I'll say goodbye to the people in the room, Zoom room. Thank you for joining us. This recording will be available later if you want to come back over it. And thank you to Olivia. I'll see you all soon.